Let's see. So Andrew and Jack Miskin, you guys are friends. You guys have been friends for 30 years?
Yeah,
Oh,
give or take.
calm down. 27.
9 months, 30 days, 14 hours. Yeah,
And you
that's
guys,
what anyone's counting.
so you're both part of True Life now. You originally met at a different church, right? Then you ended up at Relevant Church, and then long story, but now you're at True Life Church. You guys are successful, two white successful older guys, older than me. And there's a stereotype about that demographic. There seems to be a stereotype about that demographic that you don't care about issues affecting the oppressed and the poor and the marginalized. Right? I mean, you've heard those stereotypes. You guys are not that. You don't fit that stereotype. You've been processing stuff related to the racial issue for a while. I know I've had conversations with both you guys. And I just wanted to hear, and I wanted other people to have a chance to hear how two white guys have been processing this. So I'll just rattle off different questions. We'll dialogue, we'll talk, and then we'll see where it goes for the next 40 minutes or so. So why don't we start with you, Andrew? You came over from Great Britain, and when you first came here to America, was there a difference between race relations here that you immediately noticed versus over there?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the first things that we did when we got here, we went on a road trip to Washington, D.C. And I remember driving through the suburbs to get to the area where the White House is and all the things that you want to go and see. And I remember pulling up against a car that had bullet holes in the side of it. And I remember pointing it out to the people with us. There were basically 4 British people in the car, me, my wife, and then 2 other therapists who were working over. I pointed out the bullet holes, and we just discreetly locked the car. And we realized that we were in a black neighborhood, which in England, in inner city areas, you'll find racially. In England, we have inner city areas that are predominantly one religion or one race. But I've never felt anything quite like it when we came to Washington, D.C. To be in an area like this where you have one town like Deal, which is Syrian Jews, next to Asbury Park, which is Black and Hispanic, it's being gentrified now, next to Ocean Grove, which is Methodist, next to, you got Spring Lake, Irish Catholic, and it also segregated. I mean, we had never come across anything quite like that. It's very much more distinct here than it is back in the UK. And I think that's partly because of the history of immigration, right? That people tend to accumulate as their own kind. And I think that's a throwback to that.
Why don't they do that as much as in England?
Well, we do, but not on the same scale as here, I don't think. In an inner city area, yes, that definitely happens. But in the suburbs like this, it was kind of unusual. The other thing that struck us very early on was people's freedom to express very racist thoughts. We were at a work-related party in Point Pleasant within the first few weeks of being here, and someone used an incredibly derogatory term to refer to Black people. And 27 years ago, the British people that we hung out with were at least sophisticated enough to keep those racist ideas to themselves and not sharing them freely at a party amongst, colleagues and colleagues' spouses. And so that was a shock. And I think that, England is much more progressive in this regards. Do we have an issue with racism? Of course we do. But I don't think it's as stark as it is here.
Is it more stark over there? Is it more stark between certain cultures or ethnicities versus race than it is here, or is it not even?
Well, there is issues between different cultures. So we don't have immigrants from Mexico, from Central and Southern America, who are all Latino, right? Hispanic. We have immigration from Eastern Europe. And so there is a big groundswell against these Eastern Europeans coming in, taking our jobs, even though they're the guys doing the jobs that you and I wouldn't want to do, like working in fields and stuff like that, So the Eastern Europeans are the British equivalent of the Mexicans, as we label, coming from the South,
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there's bias, there's prejudice, there's racism, there's bigotry. All of that exists over there. But I would say on the whole here, it's on steroids.
And you guys fostered to adopt a young black boy. You had 3 kids, fostered to adopt a 4th.
Yeah.
Travis, were you looking to get a black kid in particular, or any kid?
No, we did it because we could. We did it. We have always had very strong opinions about abortion, and we've always felt that if you're going to have a strong opinion about something, you better be part of the solution. And adoption is right now, and unfortunately transracial adoption is a vital part of the solution to, it's one part of the solution to dealing with that.
Yeah.
So we weren't specifically looking for a black kid, but we were open to any kid of any race. And within New Jersey, within the foster to adopt system, there is an almost unlimited number of black boys in particular.
Gotcha. Now, Jack, and well, I guess this is for both of you guys. You both settled down into Andrew, the white suburbs of Wall, which is not very diverse, right? And Jack, Manasquan. Growing up, raising your families there, did it stand out to you that, man, it's not very diverse here? Like, did you guys? Was that did you feel the lack of diversity, or did it not really phase you at all while you were raising your families? And I'm just asking, was that a value of yours? Like, okay, we're going to give up that for this, or was it not really on your radar?
I think that when we decided to settle, to move to Manasquan, we were always living in. Once we got married, we basically lived in Monmouth County, and we lived with our in-laws for a little while, and bought our first house in Wall, and moved to Manasquan primarily because we had heard about the quality of the schools, and we were kind of, focused on, both Lori and I had been the product of Catholic schooling, and we were kind of the opinion that we wanted to have our children not go through parochial schools and to have them educated in public schools. And so we kind of were focused on, well, what schools are good schools? And so I'm not sure how Manasquan got to the front of that class, but it did, and we ended up moving there. We found out very quickly, we certainly knew this area is pretty much a lot of the same types of folks. And to be honest, our challenge, in retrospect, we probably would have done a lot better, especially with our son. We have 3 girls and a boy, who are all adult children now, but he did not fit the very strict mold of the Manasquan kid. He was not athletic. He did not surf. He was, a bit of a nerd. He was a really bright kid, but his interests were in no way aligned with almost anyone that he went to school with. And so we didn't think we saw the lack of diversity, but it certainly never struck me from a racial standpoint, because, we kind of knew this is the area, but, it clearly is, it is just this part of southern Monmouth County is pretty homogeneous when it comes to culture in that regard. So
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Gotcha.
we started out in brick, which is very white. I don't know what it's like now compared to 14 years ago when we left, but certainly back then it was incredibly white. We moved to wall, which didn't seem any whiter, but maybe is a little bit whiter than brick. I'm not sure per capita whether that's true. But it never crossed our minds to move to a town because it was black. I mean, we knew that raising a black kid in a town like Wall or Brick would create issues, but no more issues than just raising a black kid in a white family
Okay.
would create.
Okay.
Um,
And did it? I mean, what was it? Was there more issues in Wall than you thought there would be?
No, I have to say not, honestly. I can't think of many
Gotcha.
incidences of racism that we've experienced like one-on-one. It's really tough to gauge, right? Because often it's very subtle. People,
Sure.
don't say things to your face. I can't honestly say that we've had people who've looked sideways at us or
Yeah.
questioned us about who this kid was or anything. I suspect, I mean, we've had the conversation with Travis about driving in Wall because I've noticed the number of black people pulled over in Wall. It seems extremely high. So we've had to have the conversation that every parent of a black kid has with their child. But
Yeah.
no, he hasn't described too many incidents of racism or really anything significant at school. I think kids of his generation and younger are much more compassionate and tolerant and inclusive than our generation. So it hasn't been
Gotcha.
a difficult thing. Yeah.
So let me just cut to the present then. You guys are processing. I've had conversations with you guys. Where do you feel like just open-ended question, like how has your thinking on race relations and your part in racial reconciliation, what God is calling you to do as a Christ follower, what are some thoughts that you've had over the last few weeks, months, maybe recent years that have evolved? I know that's very open.
Well, I'm just waiting to see if Jack's going to start or if I'm going to start.
I don't know. I guess I can start. I guess the biggest thing for me is coming to the realization that because I'm part of the majority culture, because I'm part of the white culture, that it is just not enough to not be racist. Like that's just not going to get it done. I kind of always have, just engaged with everybody in on a personal level, and I don't, not that, I'm not particularly fond of the idea of not seeing color. Of course I see color. And I think it's important to see people, because I think not seeing that, saying that you don't see that almost discounts the person you're regarding and you're engaging with. But I just, it's never, like, it has never been an issue to me. It's been, I'm meeting someone in a context and I regard them in the context I'm meeting them. If I'm meeting them because of work, I'm dealing with them on a work level. If I'm meeting them because we have a certain hobby, well, then it's the hobby, so it just never was that. And so I didn't really kind of have the lens of, well, that's great. That works for you because you're part of the majority. And the fact that, you may not act or think, and it's really about thinking, because I'm sure there's plenty of things I've said or done that might be racist, but the fact that you don't think that way or that your heart's that way, it just can't, it's clearly not enough. The change is never going to come. And I heard a lot of people say a lot of things over the past few months. And, one of those things that I'm not even sure who said that has stuck with me is that, if you think that there's really going to be change and you think that the minority is going to drive that and lead that, why would you think that? You're the majority people, and the people who are, form the biggest group are the ones with the power and with all of the privilege and all of the access. So, like, if you want things to be fair, you've got to kind of do something about that. and just, it's always kind of been, well, I'm okay with all of the things that are going on, but I never regarded it as being, as I always regarded that as being enough. And that's clearly just not in any way enough. And that, I don't know what tipped it, but something in the last couple of, I would say 6 months to 2 years has really kind of changed things.
For you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's just to kind of finish the thought there, our youngest daughter has been dating a man who is Jamaican. He is, fairly dark skinned, and they've been dating for a couple of years now. And so maybe there's this, and I don't know, I would never presume to know where it's going to end up or how it's going to end up, but like on a subconscious level, there's this thought, well, what if Juan is my son-in-law? What if they do get married? What if they have children? What if they don't get married and have children? What if, that's going to impact me. And I'm sure that on some level has played a part. But yeah, I'm not sure how to say what changed, but I just somewhere I just, have gotten to a point where enough is enough. And I feel like, I've just got to be part of something that moves the ball forward a bit.
I grew up with the idea that slavery was an American problem, right? I grew up being very proud of the British Empire, being proud of England and the United Kingdom, Great Britain, everything that we stood for, our values that we were spreading around the world, only to realize more recently that a lot of what America was doing on American soil, us British people were doing in their own country. So we were basically going to a place and we were becoming Caribbean islands, and we were basically enslaving, for want of a better word, the local people. So we might not have ever had slavery on British soil, but we are really caught up in that. And so, I've been thinking a lot about the history that I learned as a kid, right? This idea of white superiority, of white privilege. I've lived in a lot of different places, and in every single situation, my whiteness, the fact that I'm a white man, has always been an incredibly positive thing that has gotten me ahead. One thing that, if I meet an average American person, my accent has been ruined over 27 years, but they still hear an English accent, which most British people don't, but they call it an English accent, right? Along with that accent are a lot of positive assumptions. The assumption that you're well-educated, that you're intelligent, neither of which in my case are particularly true. And I'm not just being self-deprecating, they really aren't. Whereas if you have a Hispanic accent, then there's some assumptions that a lot of people make about that, right? And one could be that you're here illegally, another one could be that you're not particularly well educated. And so that's just maybe a bad example of how white privilege has kind of helped me to get ahead in this country. And so I've been thinking a lot recently about some of these things, some of these issues, and there's just a lot of things that have come together. Of course, raising a Black child, it's been on my radar for a long time. And more and more and more, because of smartphones, people are being able to record some of the daily abuse of living while Black in America, checking into an Airbnb as a Black woman and having the police called on you, trying to get into your gated community and having the police called on you. I mean, just living while Black has become a real thing and is caught almost daily on camera. And it just offends me and appalls me. And I think that we need to appreciate it's not a left issue, it's not a right issue. Of course, I can't speak for Black people, but I can speak as a parent of a Black child. And I think that we as white, middle-class, middle-aged men, we need to get involved, and we need to add our voices to the chorus of voices that is saying enough is enough, something has to change.
One of the arguments from some people is we're talking about it now. We're talking about it too much, and everything's racist, and every every disparity is because of race. And that's just fanning the flames. That's pouring gasoline into the fire. So how do you discern between, okay, here's a disparity that may not be necessarily because of race. It may be because of socioeconomic. Could be for a variety of other reasons. Between, okay, this is because of race, so we need to speak out against this. Like, how do you, and I'm talking to you, Jack, discern between this is what it means to kick the ball forward, and this, I still got to do some research on that one. I still got to wrap my head around that one. You know what I'm asking?
Yeah. I guess a lot of things. I think that one of the challenges that I think we're all going to have in terms of, making progress is everything is interconnected, right? And so making improvements, and then there are, there's, one end of things, if we lived in a world where we could make sure that there wasn't profiling going on against any ethnic group, that would be great, right? And then that's pretty straightforward. But the idea that a person can have the same opportunity as any other person, well, I'm not sure that's possible for any two people, let alone a white person and a black person, or a white person and a Hispanic person who's a little less black or whatever. I think that, we all are unique, and we all come to our circumstance with all sorts of history, baggage, opportunity, or lack of opportunity. And I do think that, there is certainly, I believe there is a decided disadvantage that people have. I think in terms of moving it forward, I don't know. I want to be helpful. I don't know. When I hear someone talk, I think, well, okay, I agree with some of that, but and I support that person, and I respect that person, but I'm not sure I agree with that. So do I not support that aspect and now look like I'm not supporting their intention of making change on that issue? I don't know. I think, it's gonna be a long, hard way forward of every single thing that we try to change. We're gonna have to engage. We're gonna have to dialogue. We're gonna have to really, get into the meat of it. And I don't know. It's always the details. It's, well, how do we get from where we are to where we want to be? What does that mean?
But do you not think that we can't really even address that issue until there's an acknowledgement on the part of us, the people in power, an acknowledgement of what got us here?
Yeah.
And why there is such a massive disparity. Of course, there is economic disparity within the white race within
Sure.
the country. But, I didn't really study American history. I think in England, we covered it in like a day, maybe half an hour, because it's a blip on our British. But my understanding is that this country has slavery started 400 years ago and went on for about 250 years. Mm-hmm. Immediately after it was abolished, a lot of the country, the states where it was practiced, enacted black codes, which are basically laws that imposed an incredible burden on free black people. They could either work as housekeepers, they could work as farm workers. If they were vagrants, if they didn't have a job, they could be forcibly put into labor. If they wanted to work in any fields outside of that, they had to put down like a bond of like 10 to $100 in order to not be a housekeeper or a farm laborer. How do they come up with that money? So you had this black code, and then you had the Jim Crow period, right? And then you had it like a year before I was born, finally black people got the right to vote. And you still had segregation. I mean, the history is so recent.
Yeah.
And then you had, I heard a politician talk not that long ago about how he lived in Newark, a black politician, and his family wanted to move to the suburbs because I think they were becoming more middle class, and they wanted to live in an area that wasn't a black neighborhood. But because of the redlining and because of their realtor wouldn't show them houses that weren't in a black neighborhood. The only way they were able to get into a white neighborhood was because their lawyer pretended that he was buying the house. And it wasn't until the closing that the realtor found out who really was buying the house and flipped out. And that's a story from within my lifetime. So you've got baked into the system all of these policies, laws that for generation upon generation upon generation have prevented Black people from passing wealth down, because most of wealth is truly generational, and we're going to pass on our properties to our children, or at least part of the money that comes from that. And that's going to get passed down, and that just doesn't happen within the Black community, because they as a whole, and I'm talking in a generalization, they don't have that accumulation of wealth and opportunity. We need to acknowledge that. And
I think that, and I'm sorry to jump in. I think I absolutely agree that we need to acknowledge it. And I frankly think that is one of the stumbling blocks that a lot of people have to this issue, right? There's this, when I look at, people I know and myself as in my own history, my parents were really, lower middle class would be a compliment to how I grew up. I grew up really kind of poor. And there is a feeling amongst a lot of peers, middle-aged white guys that, well, hey, I worked hard and nobody gave me things. And that's just, it's not true. Like,
it's not true. It's just not true.
And I think what the issue is that it is true that I did start with nothing and worked hard for everything I got. But one of the things that you hear all the time now on certain news programs is, well, two things can be true at the same time. Well, just because I had this experience and was able to get somewhere doesn't make someone else's experience less true or not true. And I think that there's this kind of generalization that, well, people have the opportunity, the American opportunity, but they don't. Like, and there has to be that kind of, look, it's to say that there is, white privilege does not, it doesn't take away from anything you've been able to do as a white man or as a member of the majority. It is an acknowledgement that you just have it good because you're part of the big group, not the small group. And I think that, that's really a problem.
One of the examples of white privilege that I've heard you talk about is the fact that you, Jack, can succeed and you are not held up as an example of your race. Whereas Black people who succeed are often held up as an example of, oh, they made good,
Oh,
and that's a classic example of only white privilege will allow you to kind of think that way, right?
Yeah.
We don't represent our demographic, our people. But so often, Black people who do something good or do something bad somehow represent their community as a whole, But I don't think we've either addressed the issue as white people. We have a system where 10% of the population approximately is Black, but something like 40% of the prison population is Black.
Yep.
I think it's 13% is Black in our country.
Right.
And
it's so 13. Let's say 13. But I'm pretty sure that it's something like 40% of the prison population is Black, right? So we need to answer a question, because people are afraid of Black men, right? If a Black man walked through Manasquan High Street in the dark at night, there would be this kind of reaction to that situation, right? It's an indication of how unusual that would be, but it's also this thing, this phenomena that Black men are to be feared. And also there's a higher incidence of crime within, quote, Black communities, right? So, and you can go through it, higher drug addiction than within white communities. There is, you know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
But it raises the question, either there's something wrong with the people, and we're saying that black people are more dangerous than us, black people are more likely to commit crimes than us, therefore there's something inherently wrong with black people. Or we have to say there's nothing wrong with the black people. There's something wrong with the system and the power that's in place. And that is what's causing this problem of disproportionate incarceration of black men and a higher level of violence and poverty within minority communities. And I don't think most people have ever really asked that question and come to terms with it. Because the whole yes, but is so common. Like when you talk about, that black people, if you were to say something in a predominantly white or an entirely white group of people talking about race, I bet you someone is going to say that, yeah, but what about the fact that, that there's a black on black crime, drug addiction, and, it's the yes, but. So basically it brings back to this question. Either there's something wrong with black people, and if you believe there is, then you're inherently racist, right? Or if you're saying, no, there's nothing wrong with black people, there's something wrong with the system that has caused this higher level of incarceration and this higher level of crime in their communities and drug addiction.
So Andrew, yeah, can I just cut you off for a second? Because I agree with you, and I think so. Black on black crime and like that is high, and I would agree with you that that's another example that there is something wrong with the system. Not that there's something wrong with black people.
Well, you say that, but I would say this, that a high number of white people don't think exactly that. They think there's something inherently wrong with black people.
Well,
and we need to kind of question ourselves on that. Because
and that's my question. What gets threatened in a white person that makes them feel like it has to be a yes, but what about the black on black crime? Instead of, yes, and the black on black crime is another example of the system being broken. We've got to do something about that.
Well, my feeling is it's simply because we live in a bubble. We can create a bubble for ourselves, particularly because we're people of means. And I'm if you're talking about the top 5%, that includes the vast majority of people in our church, not just Jack and I. That involves a ton of people. So we have the ability to create this bubble and to not have to get down to the nitty-gritty of why we got to this point. And I think it ties into questioning patriotism. I think some of the patriotism that is expressed in this country is bordering on white nationalism. I think it can be toxic. I think it can be an idol for a lot of people, even a lot of Christians, particularly a lot of Christians. I think politics is another idol. I think people are so entrenched and so caught up in this bubble that they would rather not deal with these issues because they are so complicated. It's so multifaceted. I don't think we know where to begin to address it, to fix it. It is so complicated. And I think the easiest thing for people to do is to just stay away from those areas, never come across it, and just stay in their isolated little worlds. And I think that, that's it. I think we just create this cocoon around ourselves just so we don't have to get down to the really tough conversations. Now, the other thing too that, I said, if you think that there's something inherently wrong with black people, you're racist. And I stand by that. I mean, to me, that's an undeniable statement. If you don't think the problem is society that has created this, then to me, that's an undeniable racist thing that you believe. But I want to be clear. I think that when we talk about racism, it's very easy for people to say, well, I'm not racist. And I think it's important for us, particularly as white guys, to acknowledge that it's a fluid thing. I have a black son, but I have racist thoughts. I behave differently sometimes around people of a different race or a different ethnicity. I have to take those thoughts captive, and it's an evolution. And I am in a different place now to the place that I was 20 years ago and 10 years before that, and even 6 months ago. And I think it's important that we are comfortable admitting that we have biases and prejudices and bigotries and racism, which I think we also need to understand how they're all different from each other as well. I don't think any of us really thought this through as white guys, what all these different things are and what they all mean. I think it's a really complicated thing. And I think part of it is admitting there's this problem with society, admitting that we hold at least bigoted or prejudiced ideas, and that it's an ongoing battle. And we could say something racist today and something anti-racist tomorrow. And
I think that is important to acknowledge, because I think people I think there's a lot of fear of being labeled a racist.
Right.
And I think that I think it's dangerous once you get into, it's almost like when I'm having a conversation with my wife, sometimes she'll say, "You're not listening." And I'm saying, I am listening, but now you've got me analyzing how I'm listening, and I'm focused on proving to you that I'm listening, that I'm not even listening. Like, I'm so focused on whether like proving to you that I'm listening, that I'm not really listening. And I think that's a reaction some white folks have, is I've got to prove that I'm racist, that I'm not racist, that the walls go up, defenses go up, and this conversation just tweaks them out, that I just want to back off of it, because if I say the wrong thing, if I do the wrong thing, if I don't do exactly what you're doing, you're going to say I'm racist. So I don't want to, and they can't acknowledge. And I think what you just said is incredibly helpful for that, that it is fluid. And there are times when, like, you might be characteristically anti-racist, and then have moments of where you are, and you got to deal with that and acknowledge that and confess that and repent of that. And I think that's really very insightful what you just said, that it's fluid. Now,
it's an uncomfortable thing to admit that you think racist thoughts, but it's a very liberating thing to be able to say, you know what, I'm a work in progress, and I think that without that, it's really tough to move on. You know,
Andrew, you got a list. Why don't you share some of that list?
Okay, well, I mean, you gotta précis this list by saying, I'm a middle-aged white middle-class guy, right? So I'm coming at it from that perspective, and so this isn't accurate. It's just my thoughts. Things that we can do to fight racial justice as white middle-class, middle-aged men: explore and admit to white privilege. If you can't think of at least a dozen examples in your own life, you're really not thinking hard enough. 2, protest. And I went to the Asbury protest, and it would have been so much better if there were more people like me, dressed in their work clothes, getting alongside those young radical people, showing that this is an issue that we care about, and we throw our support behind them. And if middle-aged white guys are there and their wives bringing their grandchildren, it's going to create a whole different atmosphere, and it's going to give a lot more credibility to it. So I put protest. This shouldn't be seen as the actions of the liberal fringe.
Now, and do you think that would help prevent some of the radical reactions that have happened?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. How can it not? I mean, I think that seeing young children there is going to create a completely different atmosphere. Seeing people dressed to the nines in their work clothes, it gives more credibility. So when the cameras are on you, it can't be dismissed by the extreme right wing, who are basically emphasizing the rioting and the violence. It can't be just dismissed as this radical, crazy nut job fringe. Another thought: find common ground with secular organizations committed to racial justice. Waiting for organizations to match up completely with our value system before we get involved is a perfect excuse to remain inactive. This idea of non-racism or anti-racism, we've got to take that on board. I know the Black Lives Matter movement, not the people who are using the slogan, but the movement may have ideas that don't match up with our Christian values. But find another organization and get involved. They're out there. And I don't think we should use that as an excuse just to sit on the side.
You know what? Let me just say that they are out there, and I think that's it's the sentiment has far moved past the organization that has ideologies that doesn't line up with Christian values. There's so many other organizations that are expressing that sentiment, and so I just want to affirm what you just said, that there's so many so some Christians.
So rethink our politics, supporting candidates who prioritize poverty, racial equality, the sanctity of life, both in and out of the womb, even if they don't fully reflect our conservative or liberal values. Now, I think you said in a sermon, right, how Christians should be, I think you were quoting someone, I wrote it down here, should be concerned with four things. It was a quote from Tim Keller. Sexual purity, the unborn, poverty, and racial equality. And it tends to be that liberals focus on two and conservatives focus on the other two, right? But we can't just do that. We need to make racial equality one of those priorities, because it's a basic human right and it's a Christian value. And I think that if we just stick to our typical left-right leanings and don't come at it with the idea, no, racial equality has to be a high priority, to disassemble these structures that have basically made it hard for Black people to get ahead, then I think we're really missing out. This one here, it's kind of a bit vague, but I've said, consider what you're willing to give up or not give up in the fight against racial equality. As Christians, I think we latch onto certain things, and we're so into that we're not willing to make this a priority. And I think we need to question, I'm not going to suggest the things that we should give up, but I think that we need to really ask that question. Another thing, let's reject the sin of omission, which is silence, right? I'll no longer tolerate your overt, subtle bigotry. I've been in way too many Christian settings with men where jokes have been made that are demeaning to people. I think transgendered people are the whipping boys, if you want to call them that we can legitimately pick on, unlike Black people, because we have some Black people in our church. How many transgendered people are going to set foot in our church? Probably none. And so I've heard way too many people using derogatory terms, implying people are feminine. Just
in our church.
Let me put it this way. In the last 10 years, I've heard way too many examples of people feeling comfortable to say things that are prejudiced, bigoted, cruel, hurtful in church situations. Within my social group, which is predominantly church people. I think we feel like we can get away with it when we pick a group. It's kind of like picking on Eskimos, right? When are you going to see an Eskimo? You're never gonna. So you can make Eskimo jokes as long as you want, because you're never going to come across an Eskimo. But you might think twice about saying something derogatory or joke about Black people, because there's a possibility that you have a friend who's Black or know someone who's Black. And so all I'm saying is we got to be careful we don't substitute one type of prejudice for another. And and I think personally, we need to call it out. I think that I got into a discussion about this with someone in the church, and he was saying, no, we need to take a softly approach, putting our arm around them, taking them aside. Sometimes I think, you know what, if you're in my house, I don't want to hear that kind of talk. That's prejudice, and I'm not tolerating it here. Sometimes I think we need to say that. Hopefully there's not going to be many occasions where we need to do, but I think calling each other out, and that's going to keep us on my toes. If you know that I'm going to call you out in a room full of people because you're saying something that's off color about a people group that isn't represented here, it's going to make you think twice. And I think we all need to be open with each other enough that we can do that. And it might be uncomfortable, but I think it's really, really important that we take that on. I've got a few more if you have the time. Learn about confirmation bias and its effect on perpetuating our prejudiced and bigoted ideas. And I put after that, it's a vital part of repentance, in my opinion. So often something will happen. Right now, the Orthodox Jewish community and the COVID virus are a perfect example of that. How some person gets arrested for, or gets called out for a get together, and we tell that story about, see what they're doing, and that incident confirms our bias that Orthodox Jewish people in Lakewood don't care about the virus and they're being careless. And I've had more than one conversation with Orthodox Jewish people who are really upset about what's going on in some parts of their community and how they're being perceived. And I think we just need to be very careful and just learn about the concept of confirmation bias and how it just plays into our biases and prejudices. I think it's really important. Refuse to repost, retweet, repeat anything that reinforces a racial, cultural, or religious stereotype or fuel hate, anger, or distrust. Rather, hunt for mitigating factors that may provide an alternative, more compassionate explanation. And I think that if we hear something, instead of retweeting it or posting it, we kind of take their side and say, okay, what could cause this thing to happen? I think it's going to profoundly change how our Facebook feed looks. But if you're saying something which is condemning looting, but not a single post on your Facebook feed is in support of Black people, then that shows your bias. And that basically is telling Black people you're more concerned about getting back to peace and harmony than you are to see change on the Black issue. And I think that we need to be really aware of what's the message that we're giving with a single post or our posts in totality. And if we were to stop and really look, I think you'd be amazed at how many people's posts give the subtle or not so subtle message that I'm much more for the status quo than I am for wanting real, meaningful change. So I think that's something that we need to strongly consider. Put some effort into truly empathizing with those who don't sound like, look like, or live like you. Maybe they have something we don't, maybe they don't. We just don't know. We think we do, but we don't. And, one thing, I can be friends with Black middle-class people because it's easy. The only thing that's different about them is that they're Black, right? I'm simplifying it.
Yeah.
But I might feel very uncomfortable befriending someone who's out of my class, out of my race, out of my socioeconomic group, which is tied into class. And one thing that I've learned from traveling is that there are cultures, there are religions, there are societies around the world who live very differently to us. And you might think of them as being some backward Asian country, but the quality of their life compared to the life here in America has a richness to it that often we miss, in the simplicity of it, in the relationships that they have with people, the lack of this crazy frenetic life that we run around accumulating and spending and accumulating and spending. So I think spending time on getting to know people of different races, different cultures, religions, and so on, I think it's a profoundly important thing for us to do.
Yeah, and I'll just real quick interject. It's another discussion, but the overlay of racial prejudice and socioeconomic prejudice and prejudice about that neighborhood, that particular area, I think I think a lot of people who say I'm not racist are accurate. They're not racist, but they have a prejudice towards a certain kind of people group that is not like you use the middle class white and middle class Black, probably have no problem. But if you saw three males, Black African American males, walking down the street in a lower socioeconomic neighborhood, you're going to have stuff come up in your head more likely, and that's a prejudice. It's not solely based on race. There's few factors involved.
Yeah.
And I think people need to put aside this, again, am I racist? Am I not racist? And go, I've got prejudices, and I need to discover which types of people groups set me off and trigger me a little bit. I need to lean into that. Anyway, I'm sorry to interject.
No, it's good. This one, put some time into getting to know people of another race. I said that the majority of white people have absolutely no Black friends. Make some. Contrived, maybe, uncomfortable, you tell me. intentionally reaching out, maybe the step that you need to shatter narrow, simplistic thinking and genuinely wanting to get to know what makes someone tick is a basic foundation for any meaningful relationship. So it's a weird one because it sounds so fake. But I tell you, I think that if you live in a street and you have a black neighbor who lives 10 doors down and you've never had a meaningful conversation, and I think if you were to knock on his door and say, I want to have a chat with you, and this is going to sound really bizarre, but I desperately need to know your perspective on what's going on right now. And can you come over and we'll have a drink and we'll talk about it? I tell you, it's going to profoundly influence me, the white guy knocking on the door. It's going to profoundly affect them. And, you know, you're going to realize that you have way more in common than you have different. So I think that that's something that's worth considering. Spend quality time reading books, articles, watching movies, documentaries that address black issues, particularly their struggle and achievements. It's common sense that the more racially diverse your media consumption, the less us and them thinking you're going to have. Revisit American history, question extreme patriotism and nationalism. White American history and Black American history reflect two vastly different stories. And I think that's a really difficult one for a lot of people because they don't want their history erased, as they call it. But I would venture to say that the history that you learned in school is not historically accurate. I've learned things that I've never heard before in the last few weeks, just trying to educate myself about some aspects of Black history. And I think that it's really important that we explore that and explore nationalism. You know, you say you're proud to be an American, which I am. But what aspects of American history are you ashamed of? And I think if you're not willing to really go there, then your patriotism is just nonsense. It's based on a completely flawed construct. So I think that needs to be explored. Take a break from political commentary shows. They're not news. Don Lemon, Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, Rachel Maddow are not reporters, and they thrive off your rage and fear. Find and use a news outlet that does not have an overt or heavy political leaning. They exist, but people don't want to put the time and effort into watching them because we've got so used to the news stories confirming our confirmation bias that I talked about earlier. So I think that's a really important step to just being open-minded. Find and use, foster or adopt one or more of the thousands of Black children in New Jersey in state care. If we as white people are opposed to abortion, I don't know why the church isn't filled with foster and adopted kids. If you want to find out whether you can truly love a Black kid, foster them. And you'll end up, if they're free legally, you'll end up adopting them because you'll realize that ultimately that color doesn't make any difference. That's something that I learned. I didn't know it in the beginning, but that's something that I learned when I got to know a Black kid 28, 29 years ago in the UK. I developed an attachment for this kid, and it made me realize, wow, I could love a Black kid. And it was that was one of the things that led to us ultimately adopting a Black kid. But I had to learn that. And it was a surprise to me when I learned it, that it was an issue that I worked through, you know.
Wow. That's powerful.
I forget the guy's name in our church, Kevin? No. Become a big brother or big sister to an at-risk kid.
Oh, Jeremy.
Jeremy. Pursue increased racial diversity in leadership in the church. I think if our leadership in our church doesn't at least reflect the community, my thoughts on affirmative action have changed dramatically in the last few months as I really got into how entrenched in our system white privilege is. And I think that we need to be putting people in leadership who have the skills. You know, Travis, my youngest, is an airman. He's in the Air Force now. There's an Air Force privilege, a veteran's privilege, I think they call it, that if two people go for a job equally qualified and one is a vet, the vet has to, by law, get the job. And if that's good enough for an airman in the Air Force, it's good enough for leadership in True Light Church, Chris. Make it a priority to hire Black people and promote Black people and other minorities. I mean, I have 12 employees. Currently, none of them are Black. I've had Black people working in the office before, but it's something that I'm going to be much more intentional about when going through resumes and interviewing people. And because I want to be an example to the community. And that's all I have.
It's a good list, man. It's a good list. We definitely need to have a part 2 where we can talk about that list a little bit more. Seriously, we'll have to have a part 2, and maybe we'll have somebody else join us or what. But I definitely think it'd be good to kind of go back through that list and talk about a few things in a little more depth, a little more nuanced ways. Mm-hmm. Jack, would you just mind closing, praying for our families, our roles, our church, our impact on this?
Yeah. God, I gotta thank you for the opportunity to spend some time together with these 2 good friends. And I thank you for what you're doing in our hearts and in hearts all across the world, which is instilling in us pieces of you. And you created all of us. And this is, this topic as a follower of your son who gave his life for all people. And
you there, Jack?
Just say amen when he comes back on.
Jack.
Amen.